Today we're going to hear from a very amazing group of people from diverse backgrounds to talk about climate adaptation, very hot topic when juxtaposed to mitigation, and I think one of the fastest growing professional areas of climate. We're going to spend about 10 minutes each talking about climate adaptation, and then we're going to open it up to Q&A. So we're going to leave a good amount of time for Q&A, 20 or 30 minutes. James Hogan was supposed to be here today, but he's ill, so we are going to be missing him. I'd like to first introduce everyone, and then we'll open it up to the presentation. So we're going to start with Alan Wright, a management consultant with Hassett Wilson, who's going to talk about his climate adaptation work with the Department of Homeland Security and FEMA. Then we're going to hear from Lindeen Patton, welcome, from Zurich Insurance Group, who will provide us a very different perspective on climate adaptation and the role the insurance agencies can play. And then finally, we'll have Michael Byrne, thank you for coming, the Executive Director from Sierra Club, who'll provide his perspectives as well. So with that, let's get going. Alan, take it away.
Great. So what I do as a management consultant for the last 3 years has been helping organizations deal with transformational change, specifically federal agencies, on a wide scale. So part of our focus here is obviously climate change adaptation, but I think what you'll hear, not only from myself, but the rest of the panelists, is that this has broad application for a wide range of issues. And I really hope that that's kind of the takeaway and the lesson from here. There's a disclaimer I have to say. I wish it was because I'm doing really, really interesting work and it's super top secret, but that's not the case. It's just kind of standard legalese language. So what I say here essentially represents my opinions, represents the work that I've done with my company, Hassett Wilson Company, and I'm not a representative of the government. So to start off our thinking about climate change adaptation, I wanted to make an analogy to what it takes to get to the White House. I don't know if it's something you all are familiar with in terms of political campaigning, but there's this great book, What It Takes, by Richard Ben Cramer. It covers the 1988 elections, and it's just fascinating. So for me, as I was thinking about adaptation, and I was trying to think more broadly and think about how can this resonate for a wide audience of people who are interested in environmental issues, and I thought, paralleling it to a political campaign and everything that it takes to get from launching your candidacy to getting to the White House is a great parallel to what it takes for a federal agency to really implement climate change adaptation. And so there are a few things that make that parallel true. One is that you have a very, very clear, well-defined end state. In this case, obviously, it's getting to the White House. Two, you have a starting point that's a very far ways away from where you want to be. And the things between that end point and that starting point, there's a lot of execution, a lot of hard work that it takes to actually get to that end state. And there are three parallels that I think speak true both to running and executing a good political campaign and being effective with climate change adaptation. And those three things are leadership, execution on the ground, and then also overcoming the unknowns. So what I want to spend time here today doing is talking about what it took for the Department of Homeland Security and FEMA to go from 2010 of not really knowing what to deal with when it came to climate change and how they were going to adapt to it, to a state in which they are now in 2013 widely recognized as a model for federal agencies on how to adapt to climate change. So that first point, an end state, a very clearly defined end state. So for me, the clearest point here was one of the headlines that I saw from Bloomberg Business Week. It's global warming, stupid. So following Hurricane Sandy, that seemed to be a really clear wake-up call for not only activists and people who are interested in environmental issues such as yourselves, but policymakers and the public writ large seemed to accept to a certain extent that Hurricane Sandy represented something new and different, and it demonstrated that climate change is happening in a way, and we have to deal with the consequences and the ramifications of it. And so for me, what I think about when I think about climate change adaptation, this is a crystal clear picture of it. That's where we want to be. We want to be at a point where, as a nation, we can look at something like Hurricane Sandy and really think, we know that that's a risk. we know that we need to adapt to it, and what are we going to do about it? So that's a very clear end state, and getting there, we're a very far ways off. So looking at the case study of Department of Homeland Security and FEMA, you got to look back at 2010 and think about their starting point. And I know it doesn't seem like it was a long ways away to be asking this question, but in 2010, they were first addressing the issue of, is climate change a risk? So I know that that's probably an unfortunate place to be for a federal agency, to be asking that question and seriously thinking, is this a risk or not? Because there was the option that they'd say, no, it's not a risk. We don't really have to think about it. But they set up a task force and issued recommendations to the secretary to explore and really dive into this issue and figure out, is first climate change a risk to the mission space of FEMA and Department of Homeland Security? And if it is a risk, how is it a risk? What are the sorts of risks that pose to the mission delivery that we have? And what are we going to do about it? So that's the next 3 points that I'll talk about here, is what they did to go from this starting point to being a model of adaptation for the federal government. First piece, and actually before I dive into this, I want to frame out these 3 critical success factors in a way that hopefully is meaningful to you and the sort of work that you do on a day-to-day basis. Think about these 3 factors as levers of influence. So there are things that you, either as environmental activist, as a journalist, as a business leader, as somebody who perhaps helps organizations deal with complex issues like we do in consulting, think about them as levers of influence. So think about the ways in which that you can actually affect change within these success factors in dealing with issues like climate change or other major transformational issues. So the first one, national leadership, I know it seems kind of obvious, but without President Obama's executive order, the specific one was 13517 that really launched all of the work that happened within federal agencies around climate change and climate change adaptation. So without that national leadership, none of the work that I'm going to speak about here and that I've been involved with my clients and my colleagues, none of that would have happened. So first and foremost, you need that national leadership. Second, you need organizational leadership. And what I mean by organizational leadership, I mean the people within Department of Homeland Security, within FEMA, people who are civil servants who do this job on a day-to-day basis, who had to step outside of their roles and really take on essentially a credibility risk and say, we as an organization need to deal with the issue of climate change, and this is what we're going to do about it. And that required ambition. It required a certain level of calculated risk to be able to take that on and drive the organization in a direction that ended up resulting in meaningful change. The third, and this for the work that we do, maybe perhaps the most important and interesting for you all, is thought leadership. So what we needed to do as a project team working on climate change adaptation, we needed to create space and an opportunity for the leaders within these organizations to deal with what climate change meant as a large-scale risk for their entire operation, for their entire mission of Department of Homeland Security. And if you think about that from a broad scale, and you think about Department of Homeland Security being the 3rd largest federal agency, you can think about how big of a challenge that is. And so what we did is set up a few, what I'll call strategy exercises, where we took them on an offsite and we created space for them in a kind of scenario planning way to think about what were the risks of climate change and what that meant to them and their organization. And really having the space for those conversations, those opportunities to discuss and meaningfully engage on what the risks of climate change were a critical success factor for actually getting the organization behind doing something about climate change. And one other program that I'll reference is the Strategic Foresight Initiative. It's kind of a long-term planning process within FEMA, and what they do is try to look out 20 years and think about what's changing in disaster management and what does that mean to us as an organization for FEMA and then the broader emergency management community. And the fact that there was that thought leadership within the organization, there was already that space to deal with these sorts of complex issues, really afforded the opportunity to deal with climate change on the scale that it presented, the challenges that it presented for the leadership. Two, so just like a political campaign, execution on the ground is so important. I don't know how many of you are fans or have seen the Netflix show House of Cards, but there's an episode in which the main character is pushing forward an education bill, and what that actually looks like, besides the idea of I'm going to champion an education bill, he throws it to a bunch of congressional staffers who get locked in a room for 2 weeks to churn out a massive bill, right? That's not a perfect parallel, but a lot of work that goes on behind the scenes within the federal government requires hardworking, talented, and dedicated nerds who care about the issue and are willing to do all that hard work to do the analysis and put together the kind of thought pieces and analysis that goes into it. Two, creating critical mass. So what I mean by that is creating the organizational capacity and the wherewithal within an organization like DHS and FEMA for the employees who work there long term to actually have the ability to deal with this sort of issue. And creating that critical mass is really crucial to the execution piece of making, an issue like climate change effective. The last piece here is effective management, and it may be something that's often overlooked and perhaps the least sexy part of the work that we do, but it's really critical for just taking on transformational change projects like climate change and actually doing something about it. So that means process, that means governance structures, project management, all the least sexy things that people are rarely willing to do. Doing that right is so critical to the execution of these types of projects. The third thing that I'll talk about is overcoming the unknown. So inertia, resistance, skepticism, that'll exist in any organization. And what's new and different and unknown about it is exactly how those things will manifest. So as a project leader or as somebody who's putting forward these types of initiatives, you need to be prepared and you need to be able to deal with these sorts of organizational barriers and think about them ahead as you're putting together a plan for figuring out what you're going to do. The second piece, this is like the October surprise within political campaigns. So in 2010, when DHS was first really getting into the issue of climate change adaptation, there was a congressional member that created an amendment to the budget for DHS, so the actual budget for operating the Department of Homeland Security, that would have made any work on climate change adaptation illegal. Would have made it illegal. So what I mean by overcoming the unknowns is that the leadership within DHS had to look at that. They had to take that seriously and say, what are we going to do about it? What the path that they took ended up being, playing it low key. Let's not promote ourselves. Let's not make climate change adaptation a really big issue. But let's do all the work in the background to drive this issue forward and not let up just because we have those congressional sources of resistance. The third piece and the final one that I'll talk about is dealing with kind of long-term risks. Department of Homeland Security and FEMA, they're traditionally kind of reactionary organizations, and they don't tend to deal with long-term risks in a meaningful way. So climate change posed to them a really novel and interesting problem that they weren't familiar with dealing with. So to be able to actually address that requires a whole host of decision support tools, new changes to how they run, simulations, modeling for how they calculate the cost-benefit assessments that go into, the flood risk maps and the flood insurance programs. All of those pieces have to be retooled to not deal with just historical challenges and historical-based data and the sorts of risks presented, but future risks. And overcoming that sort of unknown is really a crucial piece and kind of one of the biggest determinants of what will be success in the future for these organizations is how they deal with these pieces. So I'll wrap here by just talking about the kind of temporary end state that they've reached here to date in 2013, which is accomplishing meaningful progress on climate change adaptation, but it's by no means, finalized, wrapped up. They can't just close out a program and say, we've dealt with climate change, we're adapting to it, we're going to move forward. It's obviously an ongoing issue, but there's a story that the the head of the Emergency Management Agency likes to tell that I think really crystallizes the progress that they've made in these last 3 years, and that's following Hurricane Sandy, President Obama picked up the phone and called the head of the Emergency Management Agency directly and said, what are you going to do about climate change as you look at Hurricane Sandy? As we put together our response and recovery efforts, tell me what your organization is going to do to start to adapt to these risks and issues moving forward. So that seemed like a signal and a sign for a lot of the progress and a lot of the accomplishments that they've made over the last 3 years, and a signal that at least this administration is very committed to federal agencies deepening and driving forward those sorts of changes. And I'll wrap here just by referencing a few of the online links that we have to the sorts of products and thought leadership that these organizations have demonstrated.
Thank you. Thank you, Alan. Now, Lindeen.
Sure. As long as I can figure out the technology, we'll be in great shape. Don't ask someone like me.
It's on the desktop.
I might be able to.
Not my strong suit. So while we're getting the slide up, let me offer a couple pieces of information. First, I've been told that I have to speak really closely into the mic or no one can hear. Thank you very much for spending time with us today to talk about climate change adaptation. I hope that I can provide you some information from a perspective that might be a little bit different than you would otherwise get in this context. I, too, have to deliver a disclaimer. I work for a large capital market, as you may know. I'm an attorney. I serve as a chief climate product officer, and the opinions that I express today are my own. They are not necessarily the opinion of my employer. What I want to do today is share a couple pieces of information with you that you might not have easy access to that would give you a perspective about what perhaps the role of insurance is and could be in society to help society address climate change and specifically to adapt to climate change. In my personal opinion, climate change is not a science problem. It's a people problem. The scientists have been relatively clear. They have given us information. That information has uncertainty associated with it. Demographic science has uncertainty associated with it. Economics has uncertainty associated with it. I think the issue becomes how do we as a society deal with that level of uncertainty? And I would posit to you today the reason that I called my slideshow and my presentation a discussion of the climate resilience gap is because I don't think socially we're dealing with this very well at the moment. And I'm here to share some information with you to explain why I think we need to take some different actions and some different considerations about how we proceed to address adaptation to climate change. This particular slide, while a little bit busy, was an attempt to cheat and basically get 4 slides on one. So let me tell you what's going on here. In the upper left-hand corner, this is an extract of some data that was put together by Munich Re, who's probably one of the best sources of natural catastrophe data that there is. It looks from the 1990s up to current date, or a year prior, and is looking at the frequency of particular types of natural catastrophe events. There's 2 points that you should derive from this account, and if you get the slides, you can look, and there are hard links to every piece of data that I've provided. There's an internet link generally, or a citation if you have to go to a hard book for it. But in short, what this shows is that we do have an increasing frequency of event over time. Now, those can occur not just because of a particular meteorologic or climatic condition, but also because of convergence of people in harm's way, put most simply. But what's most important in the context of understanding the role of insurance in society is to begin to look at the upper right-hand corner. And what we are seeing over time is an increasing divergence between that portion of loss which is experienced on the ground by society as a result of physical impacts from climatic events, and that subset of it which is insured, and insured by private parties. This is critically important because insurance plays a stabilizing economic role in the context of society, allowing it to reconstruct quickly. It has a system which doesn't have to be restarted, it's ongoing. It's always there. And that's different than disaster recovery and response functions. Disaster and recovery response functions are not supposed to be there all the time. But the result is that in some cases, if what you're primarily depending on is disaster response as opposed to an ongoing component of stabilizing the economy, then you may have a little more disruption, a little more uncertainty economically as a result. So a couple more pieces of information that you may find useful. In the lower left-hand corner is an extraction of some work that was done in 2010 by a researcher named Dr. Cummins, along with two of his colleagues. What it catalogs is from the 1990s to present, the change in the amount of loss which is borne by the federal government in the United States as a result of natural catastrophes. If you look even predating the 1990s, what you find is prior to that date, to the extent that federal governments have been involved in natural catastrophe response, approximately 30% of economic damages on average had been indemnified or provided compensation for by federal government systems in an overall loss context for natural catastrophes. To date, and that what that meant is that the inverse, the majority of the balance of those losses in a comparative way were being picked up by private insurance in some way, shape, or form and provided indemnity as opposed to compensation. But when you begin to look in the late 2000s, you find that that ratio is almost inverted. And that the percentage of those residual economic damage payments, according to this research, is looking more to average out about 68%. From a stabilizing perspective, what that should translate to, based on other work that has been done by other researchers, is to more economic disruption after each event. And I would suggest that if any of you happen to be in the region in the southeast, as a result of Katrina, or perhaps up through the midsection of the country with Rita, or perhaps on the eastern seaboard as a result of Superstorm Sandy, which some people called a hurricane and regulators called a superstorm. You can pick as you like. I can just tell you how the law worked. In short, disruption was significant. In the lower right-hand corner is a different manipulation of that same data looking at specific named storm impacts and relative components of compensation and indemnity that was provided. Lest you think that this is not a big number issue, let me give you a little context of why I think it is so important that we reconsider the role and the ongoing role of insurance as in society to help provide economic stabilization. One of the biggest social discussions we have is about the unfunded the unfunded liability associated with Social Security. Generally, that discussion is associated with a calculation which is based on a 75-year horizon, assuming $2008. The projected shortfall of that lack of funding for the commitments of Social Security comes in around $4.7 trillion. We could argue plus or minus where that goes, but that's generally the number that's thrown around. If you apply the same metrics as Dr. Cummings did, and again, I provided the citation here, to the emerging trend, which is shown by his research in terms of what component of disaster recovery expenses are likely to be experienced as a result of current climatic conditions, and the current response costs associated with disaster recovery. The projected fund or unfunded exposure for that same 75-year period, same $2008, comes out in a range between $1.1 trillion and $5.4 trillion. So let me assure you that there are people who are doing economic analysis who understand that this is a very important social and economic issue for us to resolve, to figure out how to close that climate resilience gap. And note that the numbers that we're talking about in the Cummings research only address federal disaster recovery costs, not state exposures. Because on top of these, there are funded insurance programs which are being assumed by states under circumstances where the states decide that the risk-based price signal that comes out of the private markets is too high. And what I hope to have you thinking about as you ask questions and consider the information that's provided is what's too expensive and when. Because ultimately, this is a long-term exposure, that unless we figure out how to improve the resilience of assets, whether it's homes, whether it is infrastructure, whether it is some other social community glue, we are going to have a very significant potential of long-term, ongoing disruption. This is nothing new. This is clearly the issue of resilience has been discussed for decades. There are even statutory definitions for both multinational and for regional or local institutions for resilience. The World Bank definition, I think, is interesting. It says the ability of a system, community, or society exposed to hazards to resist, absorb, accommodate to, and recover from the effects of hazard in a timely manner. I think that's so important because what other insurance studies show is that if you have a disruption, a physical natural disaster, and people are unable to resume the conditions of the life prior to that disaster within a couple of weeks, as many as 40% of businesses don't come back. This is a people problem. It's a social problem. It's a community problem. It has to be addressed at that level on a go-forward basis. And people, when I began to get involved in the issue of insurance and climate change, kept saying, oh, this is an insurance carrier's problem. The insurers have to solve it. And my reaction to those kinds of statements is, no, this is a social problem, and we need to figure out how insurance and its skills can help society to better close that climate resilience gap and respond and be ready to be resilient in the face of climate change. But what happens, and this is the other information I want to impart to you or suggest to you that you think about, is what happens if there's just not enough money to pay for loss and damage? And this is where I think the issue of how you choose to focus your policy activism and thought leadership is critically important. Because the answer is, it depends. And it depends on what every one of us does. Recent research, which I'll share with you in a minute, suggests that it's only the uninsured portion of losses that leads to permanent macroeconomic loss, permanent GDP reduction. This is the lesson from emerging markets, not from developed markets. I don't think we should make a new lesson in developed markets that reaffirms this mathematical result. The other possibility is potential tort litigation. And we've already seen litigation emerge with an attempt to allocate responsibility to, for example, greenhouse gas emitters for impacts associated with natural catastrophes. The challenge is that the latter solution is relatively inefficient, speaking economically. People may think it's right, and they may have different opinions about who should be held accountable. But in the end, there's a finite resource, there's a finite human capacity, and a finite amount of money. And you can spend it arguing about who's going to pay for it, or you can fix the problem. And I'm not here to tell you which is the right answer for you, but I can tell you that from my perspective, I would rather fix it. So a couple of additional pieces of information. I would commend your attention to some work that was published last year out of the Bank of International Settlements. They looked at the economic impacts of 21,000 natural catastrophes. Within those, they looked at the impacts, the economic impacts of 4,500 natural catastrophes. In short, the aggregation of these particular graphs shows in the upper left-hand corner the impact on a growth path for a country if it was uninsured when a natural catastrophe hits, which is basically there's a negative impact to the gross domestic product. If there are multiple, or more than one, just more than one natural catastrophe in a period, a 1 to 10 year period, then there is a cumulative negative GDP impact on a decadal basis for that country for being uninsured for natural catastrophe. People really ought to think about that. It's important to have some mechanism for risk pooling. By contrast, on the lower line, what you see is what happens if you have adequate insurance, even if you have multiple disasters within the same decade. It's not perfect. It's not the only solution, but it's a methodology for risk financing. And I think we have to think about that as we move forward. So I would offer the following thoughts from an insurer's perspective. Climate change impacts impact different insurers differently, which is why you do not see always a unified response. For a long time, I think auto insurers didn't really think about the impacts of climate change. my expectation is that Superstorm Sandy kind of rejigged a little bit of that thinking for monoline auto underwriters. We can definitely share expertise, and we're moving to do so. We can restructure products so we can offer to rebuild, and we have done so to a higher standard, even when building codes are not keeping up with the physical exposures. And so there are things that need to be done on a governance basis, on a social basis locally, to increase resilience in building codes and some other things. But we can meet and use insurance and other risk pooling mechanisms to smooth in impacts of climate change, even where the codes aren't perfect. But you can't do it in the long term, because if it's not mandatory on a code basis, it becomes problematic for us to rebuild and for us to charge premiums for that. But we can think on the ground about proactive solutions. We can do betterment endorsements, as I've said. But overall, we need to improve the resilience of base assets. Most importantly, I want to leave you with the thought that we need new financial risk financing models. We need to figure out how we take us from current state to a resilient state. And I don't mean a resilient to absolutely everything, 100% perfect. I mean so that what you're doing is actually ending up with an economic liability that you can reasonably pool and rebuild within a short period of time after a disaster. So not everything gets blown down, not everything is under 4 feet of water, or whatever your particular exposure is. But so that you have enough in your community pool to be able to react, have the resources, and rebuild, and be back before you hit the tipping point of economic disruption and GDP destruction. So I'll stop there and say I think we have a path, and I hope we can have a discussion about that.
Thank you, Lindeen. That was very interesting. Resilience of base assets. That's a new term for me. So thank you. Okay, moving right along. Michael.
All right. Hi, everybody. Michael Brune, Director of the CR Club. I will not use a PowerPoint today. I just wanted to tell a couple personal stories to talk about 3 steps of climate adaptation. But I do feel compelled to stand in solidarity with my panelists, and so I'll issue a disclaimer of my own, which is to say that somewhere over the next 10 to 15 minutes, not exactly sure where, but I might say something positive. I know this is unusual, because when we talk about climate change, certainly when we talk about adaptation, this is a dark, gloomy conversation. So I'll try to give you a little bit of advance warning. I'll talk slowly and use gentle words when I share a hopeful note, and we'll see how it goes. But, so I wanted to just talk about these 3 steps. They're not the only steps that are needed for climate adaptation, but I think they might be among the most important. And the first one, and again, I'm approaching this from a personal level. I think the way in which all of us might be able to think about climate adaptation over the next couple years, over the next couple decades. First one is that we have to imagine ourselves in a different world. I think that if those of you who are here who are less than 20 or 20, 25 years of age or younger, you grew up into the climate conversation. You came of age in elementary school, high school, learning about climate change as you learned about the world. It helped to shape your worldview. You went through a period where climate change was one of the most high-profile issues. It dominated the national discourse for a period of time. You lived through a period where climate change plummeted. People believed in it less. People believed that there were solutions to it that were available much less. And it helped to shape how you saw yourself in the world and how you saw yourself as someone who wanted to have an impact on society. Those of us who are older than our mid-20s, we all experienced a realization that climate change was real and that it was going to impact not just our future, but our present. And I remember the first time I actually studied climate change seriously, the first presentation I ever went to, I was in high school. I grew up on the Jersey Shore. And this was just after James Hansen had testified in front of Congress. It was the summer of 1988. That fall, I went to a seminar on climate change. And I remember coming home and talking to my father, who used to be the mayor of the town that I grew up in, very interested in politics, very interested in a whole range of social causes. And I remember saying to him, you know, it's probably not going to be that bad. I said, it's only going to be a couple degrees. And like, really, what's a couple degrees going to do? And to an untrained, non-scientific perspective, I looked at sea level rises that were being predicted in the late 80s, and it was going to be 6-8 inches. And we grew up on the water. And so I thought, really, what kind of impact could that actually have? And as time has gone on, and I've had the chance to go and observe drought in the Amazon rainforest and look at the impact that it has on the lungs of the planet, or travel up to the Arctic, up in Alaska, and see the phenomenon of a drunken forest. It's what they call the melting tundra in the temperate rainforest up in Alaska. The trees are all crooked because they're rooted in a permafrost that's melting. Earlier this year, I spoke with a woman, Carol O'Toole, from Bastrop, Texas, just up the road, who had been living there for more than 30 years. And in an instant, in the wildfires on Labor Day a couple years ago, her house burned down. She said she had 5 minutes to get out of her house, to take care of her mother, and take everything that she ever cared for, load it into the car, and when she came back, the house was burned down to the ground. Personally, I went back last November to visit my parents' house, the house that I grew up in Chadwick Beach, New Jersey, on one of the barrier islands in New Jersey, after the storm last year was completely destroyed, or almost completely destroyed. First floor was completely flooded. Their house was severely damaged. Their car was severely damaged. They were made homeless for about 6 months. And these stories are not unique. When you talk to friends who might live in the eastern part of the Rockies in Colorado, you'll hear stories of one day it rained 15 inches. And over the next couple months, over the next couple years, if you don't have a personal story about extreme weather, you will. You soon will. Over the next few years, all of us, we're going to have a personal relationship with a destabilizing climate. And that's the reality that we're growing up into. So we have to, on a personal and institutional level, imagine ourselves living in a different world, because we already are, and it's going to continue to change. The second principle, I think, is it's much more fundamental, and this gets to some of the execution points that Alan was making, which is we want to act now and take strong actions, particularly for solutions that will solve multiple problems. Because when you get down into the details of climate adaptation, you realize pretty quickly that we will have to spend large amounts of money, billions of dollars, on what one of our colleagues at the Sierra Club, I think the technical term is crap, right? We're going to have to spend a lot of money on basic infrastructure that doesn't produce that much societal gain. We're just going to have to retool a lot of our systems, whether it's sewer systems, water systems, electrical systems, so that they can simply function in a changing world. But there's opportunities in the short term, over the next 3 to 5, maybe 10 years, where making big investments in climate adaptation will produce multiple benefits for society. So this goes from promoting and incentivizing local food systems, which will decrease greenhouse gas emissions, improve local health, improve community resilience, to protecting our forests and wetlands, which will, in a similar way, promote biological resiliency while also promoting community health. Here in Texas, the Sierra Club has a very aggressive Beyond Coal campaign. Coal, of course, in Texas here, the state is the largest emitter of greenhouse gas emissions in the country, and has one of the dirtiest grids in the country. Coal is one of the largest sources of greenhouse gas emissions in the state of Texas, and it's also one of the largest sources of water consumption in the state of Texas. So as we move beyond coal, and as we retire old, outdated, dirty, dangerous, deadly coal plants and replace them with clean energy, not only will we improve public health, not only will we improve and grow jobs and grow the local economy base as we invest in clean energy, but we can decrease greenhouse gas emissions and save water in the process. In a similar way, the Lone Star chapter of the Sierra Club has been working in the state legislature to promote water efficiency, and it's a similar win-win-win situation. as we compel utilities and all state agencies to ensure that every function of government, local and state, is doing water audits, doing water conservation projects, we have an opportunity, again, to save money, save water, promote jobs, and also prepare better for the future. And that type of adaptation is important. But as we take all of these steps in the short term, the third step that I think is the most important is that preparation can't mean resignation. Right? Climate preparation can't mean resignation. We can't accept that no matter what happens, we're going to grow up into a world, we're going to live in a world that is permanently, and in a society that is permanently dependent on fossil fuels. And this is where I wanted to talk about the emotional challenge that I think we all face. If you look at almost every climate analysis that's out there, or if you look at almost every article on climate change, or every conference that you're going to, this is a dark, lonely, despondent topic. It is hard to come out of a panel on climate change and feel hopeful and feel excited and feel enthusiastic. And those emotions are totally justified. Whether you grew up on the Jersey Shore, whether you live in a community that's been impacted by wildfires, or whether you've had an opportunity to see firsthand with the impact that climate change is having on societies all around the world, having a certain amount of anxiety and concern and alarm about the fact that our climate is already destabilizing is fully justified. But I'd like to suggest that there is another thing for us to consider, which is that we are making remarkable progress. And the changes that we've seen in the last 3 years regarding the installation of clean energy and the plummeting costs of clean energy should give everybody here a reason to have legitimate hope. For example, country of Denmark, 25% of their power comes from wind already. By the end of this decade, 50% of their power will be coming from wind. Country of Germany gets about as much sun as the state of Alaska, has 5 times the amount of solar that's installed than the entire United States. Portugal was north of 50% of all of their electricity coming just from solar 2 years ago. Here in Texas, one of the biggest energy markets in the country, 15% of electricity in the state is coming from wind and solar. In Iowa, we're almost at 30% of their power coming from wind. South Dakota, almost at 30%. And all of the increasing demand and the increasing amount, the inventory of clean energy is driving costs downward faster than you can believe. 80% reduction in the cost and price of solar in just the last 3 years. What that means is that we are seeing huge changes within power markets. The Sierra Club and many of our allies, we just defeated a proposed gas plant in Southern California, just outside San Diego, because solar came in cheaper. There is a coal plant in South Dakota, the Spiritwood coal plant, that was built just a few years ago, and it's currently idled. It's mothballed. Just built a couple years ago, and it's turned off because wind is cheaper. In Colorado, the biggest utility in the state of Colorado is a utility called Xcel Energy. It's their state, the state subsidiary of one of the largest utilities in the country. And an executive, they just proposed to the State Public Utilities Commission to triple the amount of solar and wind that comes online. This goes well beyond any renewable portfolio standard that's been mandated. They're not being forced to do this through litigation. They're doing it solely on economics. And their executive said to the PUC, we are promoting solar simply because it's the most reliable and the most cost-effective new form of energy that we can bring online as quickly as possible. So I believe very strongly that the despondency that typically characterizes climate conversations is one of our biggest obstacles to climate adaptation and to climate mitigation. Because the despondency and the pessimism that dominates our national discourse, it suppresses our desire to think big. And it it minimizes our appetite for ambition. And it slows us down when we want to think about a whole-scale transformation. And we should be really clear that what we are fighting for, what the Sierra Club is fighting for, is 100% clean energy society as quickly as we can. We know that when we do this, it's the best way to adapt ourselves to climate change. It's one of the best ways to create jobs. It's one of the best ways to protect public health. It's one of the best ways to bring energy security for communities all across the country. And so a lot of the climate adaptation conversation tends to be about first whether you agree that climate change exists and what the right investments might be. And to that we would say that burying your head in the sand is a dangerous strategy when the seas are rising. But for the rest of the conversation, we think that we have to dream big. And we know that one of the best ways to adapt to a changing climate is to go all in on clean energy and to displace fossil fuels with solar and wind and energy efficiency as quickly as we can. Because we know that a little child who's born today, I have a daughter who's a year old, by the time she graduates from high school, we can be living in a country where 100% of our electricity is carbon-free, where there's no more mercury from coal plants, nobody will power their phones from fracked natural gas, we're not blowing up our mountains for a tiny bit of power, we're not engaging in dumping coal ash around 2,000 communities all across the country, and every time we're investing in new energy, we can be completely confident that it's 100% safe and secure and sustainable. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Okay, we got about 10 minutes or so for Q&A, and I've also got some folks that are watching online, got their questions, but let's get the audience to participate. I think there's a microphone around, so this gentleman on the left, and then we'll go from left to right.
Mr. Brunn, could you please repeat the statistics on state use of renewables? They went by us kind of quickly.
Sure. So I started with a couple countries. Denmark's at 25% wind, soon to be at 50%. Germany has 5 times the amount of solar that's installed than the United States. And I talked about how here in Texas gets 15% of its power already from solar plus wind combined. Iowa and South Dakota are between 25 and 30. They'll soon pass the 30% of their electricity coming from wind alone in both those states. We also have California, Colorado, Minnesota that will be north of 30% by the end of the decade as well, solar plus wind.
Is that capacity or generation?
That's generation.
Okay, another question? Yeah, just the gentleman, then we'll go to the other one over there.
Hi, I'm Lisa Madry with National Wildlife Federation, and y'all alluded to some of the job creation tied to resiliency and adaptation work, and I was wondering if your organizations or if you've seen any good studies or people that you talk to, where I'm really interested in what the jobs that could come out of adaptation or the ways that jobs might change, the skills needed. And the context for that is doing some work in higher education with community colleges on how they're changing their job training programs to prepare for to create the skilled workforce needed to do the kinds of work that you're talking about.
I can speak from a very limited perspective. So in kind of state and federal agencies, there's going to be a lot of technical skills, whether it's on the financial modeling end, decision support, urban planning, and even kind of organizational planning. So a lot of technical skills, but not necessarily like engineering type skill sets might be very, very useful. I don't know, Michael, from your experience, or Lindeen?
Well, yeah, I mean, to add on to that, in addition to the planning and technical skills, I would say there's plenty of engineering and construction. There's plenty of jobs in the building trades. I would say that that's probably the majority of employment opportunities, just to begin to, community by community and state by state, adapt to a changing world.
And I would offer that I agree with what the other panelists have said, but before we can get to actually talking about job creation, we have to have a social agreement about what we're going to spend on resilience and how we're going to invest. And then I think it becomes more clear. I think the science is clear, as I said, and I think that it is clear that there's a resilience gap. There needs to be that investment, but there isn't a social agreement, and that needs to manifest in some way.
I think there was a gentleman in the middle, and then we'll go to the yellow and the black. Just this guy over here.
Thank you. Sasha Peterson with the American Society of Adaptation Professionals. And I appreciate the comments on some of the challenges and opportunities with adaptation. I was curious if you could just speak a little bit more about how do we reframe the conversation to a positive side. You spoke about how there's that clear end game, but is that end game just taking action, or is there a new vision that we could create for our communities beyond renewable energy that really includes resilience?
I will tell you that I think that there is a lot of on-the-ground action which is going on, but it's very localized, and I know that I'm working on it. I think Alan is also working on mechanisms for rolling up and reporting some of that out. In terms of making it positive, I think that for us, there are things which have manifested that are positive in the sense that we have been able to look at, but we haven't been able to organize or report. We have to work with generally researchers who can do this. That in certain anecdotal circumstances where building codes have been changed or where, for example, homes have been built to fortified standards, this has occurred in some pilots in Alabama, those homes have moved from being uninsurable to being insurable and resilient in the face of traditional or expected storm conditions. So that, to me, it is that hidden issue, right? What you want is when the storm blows through to say, wow, that was crazy, but still be able to go back to your house and have the electricity work or have it work within 2 days and have your water work. And that's not the circumstance which is present in most conditions. So I think it's working towards continued economic stabilization more than anything else. But I do see that investment going on, and it is probably most advanced. My view is global, so my job is global, so I don't spend as much time in the U.S., and I will defer to Alan on the details, but what I've seen anecdotally has clearly been the New York region. There's actually been some very interesting work going on in Vermont as a result, not of the recent storm, but a storm before. There has been some very interesting work going on in Alabama and Mississippi in particular, and some great work going on in the San Francisco Bay Area. But Alan, maybe you can come with a couple more comments on that.
Yeah, for me, I think disaster resilience is a great frame of reference. I think as a society and as a nation, we're having to deal with, the increasing impacts of extreme weather. And when you talk about disaster resilience, you're talking about the human capacity to, withstand change and bounce back and get back to, either the previous state that you were in or even better place. So I think that frame of reference, at least in the, emergency management community, the Homeland Security community, tends to be a really positive way of talking about how we deal with such a, emerging, real, transformational issue like climate change.
Okay. The gentleman in the yellow shirt.
Thank you. My name is Scott. I wondered if a possible mitigation and adaptation strategy would be to change policies and incentives to try to minimize the massive movement from rural to urban and curb it, and maybe get folks to go from urban areas back into rural in order to energize the soils to capture more carbon and perhaps to live a less consumptive lifestyle.
I'll offer a comment, but I'll tell you, I have no business or skill talking about what the right answer is. There are a lot of people who've published, who have taken, the opinion that the most efficient resource place to live is cities. I really have not evaluated that data, and as a consequence, I'll just say I think that it's easier to demonstrate resilience in certain circumstances, and the complexities that are presented for cities are very significant, and they're very different than in rural environments. And so I think sometimes it's easier to stand up and say, yeah, we made this rural place much more resilient. I could do that on a farm, pretty simple. But the complexities are when you get people in large infrastructure, shared infrastructure, it's much greater. But I don't have an opinion about whether one should move one way or the other.
Yeah, so I would just agree with Lindeen. I don't think trying to encourage a significant population shift and go against the grain, because more and more people are moving into urban areas, is the way to go, in part because people tend to live more efficiently in cities than they do out in rural places, and also just because that's awfully difficult to do. But I would say that it's clear that we do have to develop a set of strategies that work for rural communities, whether it's reforestation or finding ways to store carbon in our soil, or taking steps to, and that might be a little bit easier, but taking the steps to make sure that those rural communities are well positioned to a changing climate. I just don't think that the goal of encouraging a population shift is necessarily the way to do it.
Minimizing movement by making it more attractive to stay there.
Perhaps.
And I think there was something behind you. Yeah, the gentleman there in the black shirt. Yep.
Rob Moore with NRDC. I had two questions, actually. One is, how has the process that FEMA went through in looking at climate change a couple of years ago, how has that translated into its operations, like in hazard mitigation planning with the states, where they actually don't require states to assess climate risks at all, or in the National Flood Insurance Program? And then a second question is, why does the reinsurance industry get it and the primary insurance industry not get it?
So first question, I think the best point of reference for you, if I'm assuming the slides will be made publicly available, there in June of 2013, FEMA published its Climate Change Adaptation Implementation Plan, and it lays out the kind of eight broad-based actions that it plans to take and is ongoing to date in terms of what it's going to do regarding adaptation to climate change. And the one comment I'll make to that specifically is it's not yet at a level where they're starting to make programmatic changes to things like the National Flood Insurance Program or other, community-based grant-making programs. I think where they're at as an organization is recognizing that it's an issue that needs to be dealt with, and they're trying to figure out the right, formulas and ways in which that they're going to actually make those programmatic and organizational changes.
All right, so this is fun. First, let me just get you back to the beginning of my comment period, and I said, we have a resilience gap, and it's a social issue. It's really not a science issue. Part of that social issue is the structure in which we choose to allow commerce, especially for capital markets. So I don't think that that insurers don't get it. I think that insurers do get it. If you know the difference in how our value chain goes together, reinsurers are generally regulated as any typical corporation would be regulated in this country. And my comments, again, are my personal comments. They're not my company's, and they don't apply outside of the U.S., this particular subset of discussions. But there are parallels outside the U.S. But when it comes down to individual personal lines coverage versus commercial lines coverage, personal lines coverage is heavily regulated. The terms and conditions of the precise policies are regulated. The rating for those are regulated. And the science, the basis, the modeling is. So similar to the comments that are made about what science do regulators take into account when they do the projections, there are restrictions which emerge in consumer price regulation contexts. If you are aware, there are shared modeling institutions that serve the insurance industry. AIR, RMS, et cetera. And one of them, a year and a half ago, came out, I believe, might be 2 years ago, with a special amendment to their model, which included climate change projections. there were certain circumstances where that component of the model was submitted to regulators and rejected. And so it's important to understand that this is not being ignored. It's a social question about how we're going to frame the prioritization for that regulation. And the same applies in the case of how we expend governmental funds. For example, do we require, when we're going to build an asset, which is, let's say, has a 50-year expected life, that that asset be built to a standard which includes projections for climate change or not? I think it's a very interesting question about how climate science is or is not accommodated in the law and how that is mandated or not. By contrast, I would offer to you that, for example, there are certain countries in the world where property coverage is mandatory. It is not mandatory in the U.S. Okay? There are requirements where there are certain science requirements or certain things that need to be considered in terms of flood insurance, in terms of projections. The UK just renegotiated with the insurance industry their approach to managing this. They have a very specific approach for allocating expense and approaching the consumer price regulation, which is different than that in the U.S. I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but this is a governance and a social and a challenge that we need to have a better understanding of the economic impacts, a better understanding of risk finance, and probably a better understanding of where we want to be tomorrow.
And with that, that's a great ending. Thanks, everyone. Thank you for coming.